Welcome to the Invincible Innovation Show, the podcast for changemakers. Each week, I talk to the most fascinating entrepreneurs and innovation leaders about innovation, strategy, and design. Hey everyone! Welcome to a talk about storytelling and why it's so important for innovation. Welcome to Invincible Innovation Live Show. I'm so glad that you're here. I'm Mazor, Kario, product innovation and value creation expert, and I'll be your host. And today I have a very special guest, Steven. Hey, Steven.
Hi, Adi. Thank you so much for having me.
So happy that you're here. Stephen Taylor is the CEO of Untold Content, and we talked in the past. I'm sure it's going to be really interesting. We're live on YouTube and LinkedIn and Facebook, and you're so invited to join the discussion. And now we can start. So we're talking about storytelling, and I feel like that's a really big buzzword out there. It's like in marketing and branding and pitching and public speaking, content. So how would you define like storytelling?
So I really glad that you asked that question because this is a current piece that I'm actually working on right now. Is what is storytelling and what are stories and what's the differentiation between that and narratives? And because it's really important to know that they are different, and so you have to come at them from a different perspective. So for me, storytelling at its basics is more about personal experiences. So you can have stories that are fictional, that are created, that are based on certain attributes or things that are going on. Um, but it's around personal experiences. A lot of them, when it comes to an organization, it can be very disjointed. They're broken. They are kind of like snippets from across different parts of an organization. On the other side, a narrative is something that is constructed. It has a purpose. It has an objective. And so you can think of them like narratives are a lot of times top down, and then your stories are a lot of times very bottom up. And so when they meet together, they're really powerful. When the narratives come down and meet adjoining stories, or they can pull out stories from the organization. But it's important to know that when you are talking about branding, most of the time those are very narrative focused. But when you talk about organizational behavior and culture, a lot of times that's very story focused coming in from the bottom. So that's how
Yeah.
I think about those, especially in the work that I do around innovation storytelling.
Yeah. So it's good to see like because like a few like months back I talked to Abigail and she's teaching people to pitch and
Hmm.
we talked about something very similar but she sees it in the content of creating a story and transferring the story and it's more like theater to her. That's how she sees that. So
Yes.
it's different.
But in those pitches usually have a very specific framework. They follow a very specific pattern and they have a very objective, like a very focused objective. I need to get money. I need to get buy-in. And so it's not necessarily very story like in its makeup, but when you actually have someone sharing an experience, then you get a lot of that. There's a lot of more of those story attributes getting pulled into that narrative. So, what we talk about at Untold is actually how you take narratives and infuse stories into those. And so that brings those, you have something that's very strategic and objective focused, and actually pull in something that has that personal experience that makes people really get excited about what you're doing.
I feel that when you're telling your own story, it's much more emotional than just saying like promotional marketing stuff.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah, absolutely. There's a great example that we use. So we have a training called innovation storytelling, and it's more of a workshop. You come in, you get to go and try a bunch of different storytelling techniques. Because we've had a podcast for the last 2 years called Untold Stories of Innovation. And in that podcast, what we've really found is that there is no one way to tell a great story. That stories are very contextual. So you can't just go in and say, "Here, I'm going to use the same framework. I'm going to use the hero's journey, and that's what the story framework I'm going to use every single time." Real life doesn't work that way. And so when people are sharing their experiences, they usually don't fall back into those very traditional frameworks. They use more fragmented story patterns. So when we go through our training experience, we actually bring both the frameworks and the story patterns together. Sorry, I talked a lot with my hands, so I'm like showing.
It's
I'm
fine.
looking at my desk, but we bring these frameworks and these patterns together, and we show how they can interplay. So you can make a whole set of different types of stories based on your very specific context. So let me give you an example. Um, Matt Doyle, who is the one of the senior VPs at Procter and Gamble, shares a story about Crest white strips. When he shares his story, and I'm not going to do a good job sharing it, the way that he shares it is he says like the challenge is that it was really hard to keep the whitening agent in the mouth because you have all the saliva, and the saliva always kind of clears out whatever you put into the mouth. So it makes it a real challenge to put something there that's going to do chemistry and actually keep it in place for as long as you need. So they had this action. So they had a challenge. The action that they took was this long, what he takes you through is a really like a 2-minute serendipity story. And then the results is that they developed Crest white strips. So it goes challenge, action, results in a very traditional story framework. However, that action, that serendipity story is so rich because what he talks about that's really interesting is that um, he was the head of R&D, I think, in the oral care division at P&G when they were working on Crest white strips. There was someone in the lab who was working on the chemistry is having this really hard problem. They were in the cafeteria, and the scientist working on the project was talking with someone that was working in the wrap materials area, where they actually developed Glad press and seal food wrap. And they were talking about their work and had no real objective. But the chemist that was working on it said, "Hey, have you ever tried to contain chemistry in those little dimples in this plastic?" And they were like, "No, it wouldn't work if we were to try that." And he was like, "Well, could it contain this chemistry?" And he was like, "Well, yeah, we could try." So he literally gets up from the cafeteria. This is in the evening. Runs back to the lab. He made this stuff into a paste, pasted, kind of spread it all over the food wrap. Goes and cuts it out into little strips and puts it on his teeth. And he goes back to Matt Doyle, and the way he describes it is that this chemist runs back with this Glad wrap with with chemicals on his teeth, like saying, "I figured it out. Look." And he
I figured.
yeah,
Figured.
yeah, I figured it out. But he like shakes him, he shakes him on the arms, and he's like, "I can't even tell what you're talking about." He's like, "Yes, exactly. You can't even see that it's working, and it's working." And that was the birth. That was the moment that Crest white strips became a thing. But the thing that really inspires me with that story, and why I always start out with it, is because there's so much personal story in that one experience. And if you're thinking about how you would like to use stories, and what that type of story does is that it invites an organization, people within an organization, to say, "Hey, this is the type of behavior that we would love to see more of. We want to see more of these serendipitous discoveries occur. We would like to see people putting their work together in different ways. Let's have more incidences like this." And then
Yeah.
people hear that, and they basically get invited into that experience. And
Yeah.
so that to me that's a story. Like, to me,
Yeah.
that personal experience is a story, and he puts it within this framework of challenge, action, results.
Yeah. It's a great story. It reminds me of the story of the post-its. I guess that you know it.
Yeah.
The
Okay.
post-it story. It's very similar. You know that story?
I've heard a couple versions of it, so let's hear what you have. Go
That's
ahead.
what I know. That there was a guy who they invented glue in 3M,
Yep.
and it didn't work. So the
Yep.
glue was not good. So it was not good enough.
Yep.
And when you stick it, the paper would fall. So it was not strong enough.
Yep.
And one guy would use it in his choir when he sang in church, and he
Yes.
wanted to place the papers like as bookmarks. And he
Uh-huh.
placed these papers, and it was good for that because it was not sticky, too sticky from paper to paper. And he used it, and then they found out that it's a good idea to use it this way, just to make it not sticky, that you could take it off and place it again, and it will not like ruin the surface of the paper. So that's what
Uh,
I heard.
yes, I've heard that same story, and that's absolutely what's interesting about that story is that it's also a story of strategic latency. And when we think about innovation, we had a great conversation with Zach Davis from Lawrence Livermore National Lab. He works more in national security, but he's written a couple of books now on strategic latency, which is that, try to get this right, that the impacts of an innovation are not felt truly until years down the road. You know, until something has an opportunity to find what is going to be its real story. And there's lots of examples like that you can get with plastics. Plastics were the next big thing, and now the narrative of plastics is that it's killing everything on Earth.
Yeah.
Um, but that's a great strategic latency story. Is like it was a failure until it became this huge success, and it wasn't until you
Right.
found the right application to really bring that material to fruition, bring it out into the world. That's such a great story.
Yeah. So we have a question from a user on LinkedIn.
Okay.
There is a saying, those who tell the stories rule the world. What's your opinion on that?
That's such a good one. I mean, what I will say is that we are all storytellers at heart. So we all, we are all telling of stories. What I will say is that the winners tell the stories that rule the world. Unfortunately, is that there is, you know, we, whoever is able to, you know, if we think of like history, history is a narrative that's written by the winners, and it's not, in many instances, it is not true, or it's only half truths. So yes, those who tell the stories that endure are the ones that rule the world. It's really funny to think about the hero's journey. And I've been doing a lot of digging into the hero's journey because the hero's journey is based a lot in history. There's a lot of examples from, you know, years in your past where the story that prevails, the ones that you hear are the ones of the heroes, and those are the ones that are the success stories. And the stories that don't actually make it all the way through are the failure narratives. But what's most important is that the heroes' stories, the ones that are of success, are really important for kind of being this symbol of like what a culture is. Because a lot of times when you go to the hero's journey, it's about tribes and cultures and groups from a long time ago. The But what actually makes cultures like unifies them is actually out of those failure narratives. And so what Joseph Campbell talks about is that you have these stories that exist that are your hero's journey stories, but the things that actually bind those community together are the rituals that are in place that actually allow for failure narratives to be shared. And what we
Yeah.
see more and more in organizations, DuPont's a good example, um, MITRE's a good example, is that they have started to institute um, these rituals where people get together and actually share those failure narratives. And so
Yeah.
now you get a lot more community building with storytelling within organizations. So I agree with you. Those who tell the stories rule the world. Those who tell stories of success, those are really good for their purposes. But those stories of failure actually build communities and actually bring people together, in my
It
view.
seems like when we're talking about failures, usually people are really welcoming stories about failures, and then in the end, you succeed. That's the journey, actually, right? You're doing something; it's really hard, and you overcome it. The stories which are only failures, when you are staying on the ground, are less popular, right? And there are more of them, I guess,
The,
especially in innovation and in startups, and right?
and this is absolutely true. So what I think about with that point is that when we share stories around innovations innovation stories do not exist in this paradigm of a you have a beginning, you have this, this climax, and then you have an end. It is something that actually an innovation story is fragmented, and so you see it being fragmented over time. And so the innovation is going to, you're figuring out what is the next step, what's the next pivot. And so when you're sharing your story, in most cases, it's some fragment of this greater narrative, or this greater epic. We call it the innovation epic, but it's this, this larger continuum. And so the point is that, can we get to a point that we can push this thing all the way through? Yeah, we don't want our projects to fail at all, but but we know that there's going to be a lot of failure along the way.
Right.
And so, it's always important to think about the innovation stories being very small fragments of an overall innovation epic that
Yeah.
hopefully at the end is going to lead to success.
Yeah. So thank you for the user is asking. It reminds me of what's the definition of success, Churchill's definition, Yeah,
Go ahead. No, go ahead.
he said it's going from failure to failure without losing your enthusiasm.
I, I honestly had not heard that, but I really appreciate that.
I think
Well,
it's a good definition.
absolutely. Well, and so you find yourself failing a lot in innovation, right? So my background, I'm a chemist. So I'm an R&D chemist by training. I've come into the world of storytelling because I'm really passionate about how information gets communicated. But as a chemist, you constantly are in the process of failing, and you're trying, we call it failing, but it's, you're figuring things out, but reactions don't always work. And you might make a batch material that's bad, and you could get a result that leads you down the wrong road. So you're constantly testing, retesting, figuring things out. So you're constantly trying to navigate um, this whole identity of being a failure within your science, and it can be a challenge at times trying to work through that whole process. And one thing that I've always told people is that one of the most important reasons why you share failure stories and why you share stories in general is that it's hard when things aren't working to want to go back to the lab each and every time, because
Yeah.
you do lose that enthusiasm. You do lose the momentum, and how, you're expected as a scientist that you're going to go back because you love science to go back and do that work every single day. And that becomes a challenge. And so giving those spaces where people can actually share their experiences and share their struggles is really important for that whole motivation aspect.
Yeah, I think it's important for people to understand that they're not the only one who's failing, right? Just
Yeah.
to think that it's human to fail. And we're all like in our lives, in our professional life, in the business, in wherever, we're failing all the time. And the question is not whether we failed or not, because it's always, yes, we are sometimes failing.
Yeah.
The question is what we do about it, right?
Absolutely. So what is your experience with that, Adi?
So I'm working a lot with startups in Israel. So I'm so familiar with super excited, enthusiastic people, motivated people, and they're doing all the right things, and it's failing. And I think that 96, 98% of startups are failing in the world, which is like
Mm-hmm.
most people are hearing only about the exits and the
Oh,
unicorn, right?
yes, absolutely. It's the hero story. They overcame, but it's not
Yeah,
everyone's story. And it's
of course.
amazing that some of these startups, so we work with a lot of startups in a similar way, mostly from the storytelling aspect. They can have an absolutely knockdown story that just makes so much sense. And it still does not necessarily dictate that they're going to be successful, because there's so many other things happening in the market. There's so many dynamics, and the markets can shift so fast, and the interest can shift so fast. We do a lot of work in digital health. And so that is an area that we see, companies that are just going great, hit a shift in the market, and all of a sudden their product is no longer the next biggest and best thing, or it's, has some type of inherent flaw that they can't get around. And it's just amazing how that can just stop them even at their later stages of their raises.
Yeah, I think that in general, innovation and being an entrepreneur and innovator means you're working in an unknown terrain, and you need to know that when you're in an unknown state, you have more stakes against you. That's
Yeah,
right. That's what it is. When you're going in the road which is paved and traditional, everybody went there.
yep,
You'll do less mistakes. Let's say it this way.
yep.
So, could you give us a bit of like few tips for the perfect storytelling?
So, few tips for great storytelling. Couple of things. One, so my first tip all the time is to practice storytelling. So you can't come up with a perfect storyline in one shot. You need to go and take it just as you do an experiment with anything else. You take it, you iterate, you get feedback, and you continue to work that process. Because what you're going to find is that different audiences are going to respond differently to the different storylines that you have. So finding which storylines work best for your different audiences is, number one, most important in my mind. Number two is to go back and think about what is it that I'm really trying to get my audience to do. So this is the audience awareness piece. So obviously do all your persona canvas work, and trying to make sure that your stories are really well set up. But really, what is it that you need to get out of this? Because you're sharing, whether you're in a organization like a large organization like a big chemical company, or you're at a hospital, or you are in um, you're in a startup, you are doing this for a very specific reason. A lot of times when you're in startups, it's about your organization success. We've done some research on the motivation for storytelling based on organization size. So small companies is about the organization success. Large companies, it's more about your own personal or your team success. So know what it is that you need out of the story in order to make sure that you have your story set up right. The other thing is that look back at your personal experiences. What things have you experienced yourself that you can get people to help relate to? Those Taking those personal experiences and using those within your story frameworks can really add a lot of flavor and get people to resonate with the experiences that you have. Malcolm Gladwell has a great podcast called Revisionist History, and one of the episodes is called The King of Tears. And the King of Tears is about why does country music make people cry? Um,
Why?
yeah, why? And one of the reasons why, or his big crescendo at the end is that country music makes people cry because the specificity that's used in the music resonates specifically with their target audience. And it's the same reason, like with like hip hop music, same thing. It really resonates with that community that loves that music, as opposed to something like rock and roll, which is just very generic and no one ever really gets moved to, true emotion based on, rock and roll music. So the specificities that you add to those stories and having that aligned with your audience can really help drive them to action. The last piece of advice that I will always tell people is that sharing a story, being strategic about your communication, is not about getting a yes. It's about getting to the right next step, and that right next step may be no. And that's perfectly good because your time is highly valuable. And if what you're working on you know, is not the right thing at this point in time, or you need to make some type of pivot, you have to be able to accept no. And I know that there's lots of stories out there, people that didn't take no, and they kept pushing. Once again, hero stories. That
Yeah.
isn't necessarily going to be each and every person's story. So they have to take they have to be willing to take that feedback. So don't look at storytelling as this thing that you're trying to manipulate or you're trying to get to just getting a yes. It's about getting to the right answer so that you're being the most productive with your time and your efforts as you can and your resources.
Yeah. And I see it like when you're talking in general, I do lots of public speaking and I talk to people. And for me, the most important part is if they engage, if they are feeling some of my feelings and they are engaging with me. And maybe this time they will not get all the insights but they will get only one small fracture of what I'm saying, which is
Yep.
much more than just, just knowing all the details of what I'm saying. It's like, do you know the podcast, The Moth? Do you
I
hear
do,
it?
I do not, but go ahead.
It's stories being told by it's biographical stories people tell about their own experiences.
Okay.
And when you hear it, and sometimes the stories are really, hard to hear, and sometimes they're not that interesting, but you cannot fake this feeling of me saying something about my own experience. And
Mm,
sometimes it's funny stories. They're not like making always like making you cry, but there is something so authentic in people telling their own stories that you see it cannot be like actors. And
that's
it's one
right.
of my favorite podcasts. Like it's really, really good. So
So what
it's
is
a
that called again?
recommendation.
Yeah. What is that? What
The
is that?
Moth.
The Moth. Okay. I'll have to check that one out.
Yeah, it's an organization helping people telling their own stories. So they went to deprived areas at the beginning, like 20 years ago, just teaching people how to tell their own stories and share it. And now they have this big like events, people coming to stage and they are teaching them how to tell their own stories. And it's like like everybody's coming and listening. And they have a
Yes.
podcast right now, which is really good. When I have like time, I always listen to podcasts when I'm driving.
Yeah.
And now I really miss driving because everything is online, so I'm not going to drive that much as in the past. But it's a great thing, like when you're driving, just to hear someone and it touches you. So
Yeah, no,
yeah.
I resonate also with the pain. So when we hit the pandemic and I had actually left the chemical field and moved over and started working at Untold, I all of a sudden lost my commute. So I used to do the audiobooks and podcasts while I was driving, and basically it's been about 2 years of mostly coming downstairs to work and then going upstairs to 4 kids.
Yeah, I have 4 kids too, so it's like we're both like 4 kids. I could totally understand that.
Yeah, it's your constant juggling. But no,
Yeah.
storytelling is um, incredibly powerful tool. And I also say that don't just listen to one person's perspective on storytelling. It's like it's important. I talked to one organization. We were talking about innovation storytelling, and they said, "Well, we do TED Talk training." And I said, "Fantastic! TED Talk training is fantastic. How many times do your people give TED Talks? You can't go give a TED Talk for a group meeting. Your advisor will throw you out. You can't really give a TED Talk for a pitch, for a startup. It's not the right format. You can't leave people hanging at the end like you do with a TED Talk. So go and get as much exposure as you can to different types of ways that people are storytelling. Listen to the Brand Story Guy. He has a really great storytelling framework that people use. Basically, I call it more the guide, but it's an adaptation of the hero's journey. Um,
Mhm.
there's a lot of people that are out in academia now doing a lot more research around the connection between storytelling and innovation and how does storytelling get infused into the innovation process. And so, check out some of the peer reviewed literature. So there's a lot that's happening right now around storytelling. And as you said at the very beginning, it is a buzzword, but I think it's a buzzword because people don't get down into the specifics about like what it is and how you do it and how you measure it and then how can you do it better. And so that
Yeah.
is like if we could take it away from like the buzz term and say like here's a process and here's a bunch of resources that you can actually access and here's how you can go about making yourself better at this. I think it'll take away the buzz term part of it and make it more like this is something that is a part of what everyone should be doing.
And it needs to resonate with you. Sometimes there are some tools or some ways that you don't feel comfortable with. Sometimes
Absolutely.
it's like maybe more salesy, more
Yep.
pushy, right? And it's not for you. You could say, like, you feel in your gut that you're not comfortable there. So you
Yep.
need to find a way that makes you comfortable when you want to convey a message or to get an action from your audience or whatever.
Absolutely.
So
And you might also find that stories, you have multiple story frameworks within one conversation that you're having. So you may be giving a and but therefore framework. So that's ordinary world and something at stake, but there's some type of challenge or some type of cognitive tension. Therefore, here's our plan. And then you might combine that with the challenge action result. Here was our plan. Here's what we did. And here were the results that we got. And so from, in the world of innovation, that is a complete story that we may be putting together. And that may not work, that may work really well, but what may not work very well is something like the Pixar story spine, which is once upon a time, and there's some type of challenge, I think, and then because of this, and ever since then, and everyone lives happily ever after. So I
yeah.
mean, there's a lot of these different story structures. So get exposed, learn how to use it, learn how to know your audience, and put them into practice. Um,
But it seems like it's a tool that everybody could use everywhere. So, why do you
Absolutely.
think that storytelling is so important for innovation practically?
So specifically for innovation, it does a couple of things. And let's take it from two sides of the coin. Internal storytelling for internal communication is around culture building. So you need to get buy-in for your project, and you also need to build an innovation culture. And so from that standpoint, the sharing of stories really share those human behaviors, and you share stories that you want to get replicated. On the opposite side, it's about making things more brand aware. So then you get into more of these stories with those narratives being combined. So making things that are, making your brand seem more innovative, try to get more buy-in for a specific brand or for a specific product. Try to move get your innovation culture to be more seen as being innovative. So are your brand being seen as innovative? I think the last stat that I saw was like 57% of consumers buy from brands they perceive as being innovative or as one of their big drivers. So there's a lot of reasons, and there's a lot of different ways that storytelling impacts both the external storytelling and communication and branding, but also the internal culture building that a lot of organizations are really trying to prioritize right now. So failure story on our part. So this is one thing that I like to share people is that our work around innovation storytelling, we've been doing this for about the past 3 to 4 years, really focus on this concept of where does storytelling play in innovation. We gave a talk with the innovators community. And what we thought we needed to do, this was about a year and a half ago now, what we thought we had to do was still convince people that storytelling was really important to innovation. And at the end of the talk, everyone was like, we already know this. We know that this is an important part of this whole process. How do we do it better? And we hadn't actually built out this, what we now call the Innovation Storytelling Toolkit. We hadn't actually built that out. And so now we've built out this full toolkit that we're constantly adding to that basically has these frameworks, these patterns, and then all these different techniques that really gives you a resource to go to that you can actually sit there and click on them and like get a full tutorial on something like the hero's journey or something like how to build a persona canvas and get templates that you can use so that you don't have to go and spend a lot of time trying to find that right resource. You actually have one place that you can go to. Funny fact, innovators spend 12 hours per week storytelling. That's either listening to stories, sharing stories, crafting stories. 30% of their work week is spent in some form of strategic communication or storytelling. So that's the big thing that we're trying to
That's a
address.
lot of time.
That's a lot of time. How do we make it more effective? How do we make it more efficient? How do we make it more aligned with an organization? How do we make startups able to communicate and find their storyline faster? And having a toolkit is something that we find to be really helpful because it takes practice. And you may find the one twist in the angle that goes from a startup having no funding to all of a sudden they're hitting their first $1 million series seed.
Yeah, it sounds really interesting when you're saying it's like what you're talking about is building a skill or an expertise. But I wonder, do you think it's talent too? That there's some people who are much better at storytellers, and there are some that it's really hard for them.
There's always going to be it's like basketball. You're going to have some professional basketball players. You're going to have some amateur basketball players. You're going to have some people that are just terrible at it. But the important thing is that if it's something that's important for your career or important for your objective, you need to go and practice it. You need to go listen to examples, hear things that inspire you, see what other people get inspired by. So yes, it is a skill, but I would say it's a lot more of a skill than a talent. I think
Oh,
that you
you
can
think it's
actually.
much more a skill?
I think it can be
Really?
much more of a skill than it is a talent because you find the right experience that you had. Matt Doyle's example is great, which I think Matt's a great storyteller anyway. But he can go share that story about Crest White Strips, and any person is going to resonate with it because it was the right story around that. And he doesn't go and talk about the fact that they had to go and get buy-in from the dental association in order to actually, get them to support Crest White Strips. And they didn't talk about the process of doing that and how hard that was. It was really to when he shared his story about Crest White Strip, it was that moment in the cafeteria. And if people can find that moment in the cafeteria that they can share internally, they can get people to really get motivated. Getting
Yeah.
external, finding that right narrative, they may not have that skill, but internally, they can definitely find that story in the cafeteria.
Yeah. So, where do you use your storytelling skills in your professional life, in your daily life, in your
Yeah.
family?
Well, I would say that, where we've come to at this point is really, I mean, obviously I do it with my kids all the time, right? I love doing storytelling with my kids, and they probably do way more storytelling than I do because they're quite creative. But for me, it's around helping organizations find what is that. For me, it's really around internal communication because I faced this challenge when I was working in the chemical industry. I spent a lot of time out in China working on improving a catalyst for a process, and that was the thing that we were really focused on with our company. And the more time that I spent out there, the more that I realized, or at least I thought that I realized, that um, we were solving the wrong problem because this group did not need a better catalyst. What they needed is a way to actually deal with their spent catalyst and actually be able to um, reprocess their materials because the materials that they were producing were incredibly hazardous, or the byproduct was incredibly hazardous. And I couldn't get internal buy-in that this is something that is a big issue and this is something that we can go address. And I couldn't get that buy-in to go really pursue this project. And that really stung me hard. And it made me really passionate because there's, what's right from a business case, and that's always going to drive. But how can we make something that is just right in general that's going to benefit a lot of people, and make it align with that business case? And before I really spent a lot of time with it, I didn't necessarily have that skill set. And so that's a lot of times why I say it's more of a skill than a talent, because you got to think about what it is that you're needing, that you're hoping to get someone to do, Who is that audience? What are their pain points? How do we get it communicated in a way that it resonates with them?
Yeah. So this is your journey. This is your hero story. When you started with this problem, and now you're doing it.
Yeah, this is a passion project of mine for the past couple of years and of our team.
Yeah.
So now we're starting to see um, organizations start to implement this a little bit more and start to see some benefits of a experimental approach to storytelling and equipping to stop seeing the branding and marketing people as the only people that can be storytellers and start seeing that their entire everyone in their organization should be sharing stories around their experiences because when those stories get shared, they help create a organizational identity internally, and those organizational identities can when they start to surface, it's easier to address any issues that you might see, but it's also easier to create an organizational narrative that can then be pushed outward.
Yeah, and I
And
think it's mostly important in technological or engineering. So there are like great professionals who are speaking to you in their own language, and you don't understand it as well
yes,
as if they would tell you a story, and then you say, "Ah, now I understand it." It's like I don't understand your professional jargon, but I can relate to what you're saying.
that's right. Absolutely. Can I find, and that one's the metaphor, can you find, so like I said, we spent a lot of time in the peer review research looking at this. Metaphors for storytelling is really interesting because everyone says, what's the right metaphor? Metaphors are great, shown to be great based on science for incremental innovations because it is the next logical step. And it's like, oh, it's the Uber for this. So you can make that type of next step jump. If it's something that's radical, that's completely out there, then actually metaphors can be detrimental because it creates more questions and it creates more doubt in stakeholders that are very knowledgeable. And
Yeah.
so a lot of times those stakeholders who are knowledgeable are the ones who have the decision making power.
Wow. So I'll ask you the last questions. What's your number one tip for leaders today?
Oh, my number one tip for leaders is to listen. Oh my gosh, it's to listen. Listen to your people. Listen to the the stories that they have, the experiences that they have, and really don't come from a standpoint of necessarily having to address the questions, but listen to the commonalities between what people are saying. Shared language, shared experiences are really that driver in my mind for creating a culture. And the more that you can see it, hear it, understand it, the more that you can unify it in order to do something that's a lot bigger than itself. So to me, it's creating those spaces for leaders is create those spaces to hear. And like I gave several examples, there's many examples now of organizations building those failure rituals, creating we even call them like miniature monuments for things around failure because it's about how do you create spaces for those conversations to occur. So yeah, listening would be one, and then also I think it's really important for leaders to be able to know how to share stories that both go up the organization and also go down
Yeah.
because you're looking to create buy-in going up, going down. You're really trying to create that alignment, an aligned organization around consistent narratives. Really, is a organization that is internally strong.
Yeah. I think that in general, when we're talking about listening, this is a capacity that people don't recognize the importance of it in general.
Yeah.
Just listening, being outspoken and open and telling your opinion and being extrovert is like very strongly, encouraged, I would say.
Mm-hmm.
And listening is so important, especially like in so many domains in our lives we're not listening enough. So I would take this advice.
Yeah. And when you think about listening, it's realizing that you have a bias. To effectively listen. So I can listen to someone and I can already be formulating, here's my opinion based on what you're saying. But most likely your opinion, it has a bias attached to it. So are you really listening, or are you really just,
waiting for your turn?
That's right. Yes. Are you waiting for your turn?
So where could people hear about what you're doing and more about what you're doing and contact you?
Okay, so you can contact us at Untold Content. So you can look up untoldcontent.com. We also have a podcast called Untold Stories of Innovation. We're getting ready to get that back up and going. So please reach out. My email is steven@untoldcontent.com. You can also find me at LinkedIn. I'm pretty active there. The other thing that I will mention that we are starting to get into is that we are also starting to get into a new startup ourselves. So we're getting ready to launch a SaaS that's actually going to enable everyone to be able to put these tools and templates into place in a AI in a AI and best practices supported environment. And so we're going to try and help innovators and anyone be better storytellers by providing those tools in a more usable way.
Wow. Good luck with that, Steven.
I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Thank you for being with me. And I really loved listening to you. And it was so funny when you said we told people need to listen. And then I caught you in the middle and told you they're waiting for their own time to talk. This is what I've done.
I think that this was, you did exactly, the words that you had were exactly the words that were needed. So I appreciate that.
Nice of you. And thank you again, Steven.
Awesome. Thank you, Adi.
Sure. And to all of you change makers out there, thank you for joining us. And if you want to learn more about what I do, go to invincibleinnovation.com, and I'll see you next week with another innovative, insightful talk. See ya. I'm Mazor Kario, and you've been listening to the Invincible Innovation Podcast. Make sure to visit our website, invincibleinnovation.com, where you can learn more about our programs and my book, Innovating Through Chaos. I'll be waiting for you next week in our next episode. Thank you for listening.